Okay, our second part of the respiratory system. Remember, we left off, we're tracing the path of air through the human body. We went through the nose and the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, and into the larynx, which is your voice box. Now from there, if you look at the vocal folds that we were talking about, there's a space between them. And that's where the air is going to move into the next place. It's also, as the air is moving, what causes them to vibrate. That space, you need to know, has a name. It's called a glottis. So the space between the vocal folds is a glottis. Now the epi, remember epi means above, like epidermis, epiglottis. So above the glottis is a flap of tissue. Now we talked about when you swallow, what prevents the food and the drink from going up your nose, which is part of your respiratory tract, not your digestive system, was that little hanging punching bag in the back of your mouth called the uvula. It goes up when you swallow. Well, God put another flap of tissue that covers your larynx, your voice box, which is where the air is supposed to go and not any drink or not any food. So as you're swallowing, the uvula goes up and blocks your nasal cavities, and the epiglottis then goes over your glottis, that space, and prevents the food and the drink from going down into your respiratory tract. So it's a thin, flexible flap in front of the larynx, and it folds over and blocks the glottis during swallowing, keeping food and liquids from entering your respiratory system, the rest of it. Next, the air moves as it goes through your vocal folds and goes through that glottis. It goes into what is commonly referred to as our windpipe, and that's the trachea. And it's a tube that is carrying air from the pharynx and to the bronchi. And if you want to look at that picture there where they've taken a section out, and I want you to look at that yellow part there, because later on we're going to talk about the cartilage, the C-shaped cartilage. Now your trachea is right in front of your esophagus. So right behind that is your food tube, your esophagus. And you can see the space to the esophagus and the space that is in your trachea. Esophagus carrying food and water, trachea carrying air. And what holds open the trachea are those C-shaped cartilage, and they're all throughout. All those little bands of cartilage are all down your trachea. So it is held open by those C-shaped rings of cartilage. It too is lined with a ciliated mucous membrane, so remember the function of that: warm and moisten, and also to filter. And it ends, the trachea ends right behind your heart. And what it has to do, it has to end because you only have one trachea but get two lungs. So air now has to be divided and go to the two lungs. And that is the function of the bronchi, plural, bronchus, singular. So next the air moves into the bronchi, plural again, singular is bronchus. There are two of them because you got two lungs. And so they are what are carrying then the air from the trachea into the lungs and out of the lungs. So their function is carrying air in and out, to and from the lungs. Now look at that picture of a lung. Because I think like in elementary school, when they use the balloon as an example of how the diaphragm works, and you see how it opens and closes, you know, and puts air in it, we get a misconception about what our lungs look like, thinking that they're more like a balloon. In other words, they have a surface, but inside it's all blank, and that's where the air is going to. Look at that. That's not blank. That's not empty inside. So it's not like a balloon. Then the lungs. Now the lungs have no muscle, but they are very important in, and we're going to talk about what makes up then the lung tissue. Lungs are the main organ of the respiratory system. So they are. You need to know that fact, the main organs of the respiratory system. And inside of our lung, you have each of those bronchi going into each lung, but then it branches, and it branches, and it branches, and it branches. And as it's branching, it's also narrowing, so the tubes are getting smaller and smaller. So there's a whole bunch of branching of tubules, air tubules, inside each lung. And those little teeny branches that come off of the bronchi, as they narrow and narrow, they're called bronchioles. So air goes from the bronchi, and you can see how they branch and branch, and then finally they're taking air into the tiniest air tubes, which are called the bronchioles. And at the end of each bronchioles, you have a cluster of little tiny microscopic air sacs. And those little tiny microscopic air sacs are called the alveoli. So the purpose of a bronchial tube is to carry air into and out of the alveoli. And they're getting air from a bronchus. So we talked about one of the functions in part 1, we talked about the functions, was a gas exchange. And I said later on you'd learn where, and you need to know here is where that gas exchange takes place. It takes place in the alveoli. Alveolus is singular. They are microscopic. Now look on the outside of them. To me, they kind of resemble like a cluster of grapes. How you have the little branches holding all the grapes, and at the end you have clusters of them. So that's what it looks like, only these are air tubes, not a branch. And notice what they're surrounded by. They're surrounded by our tiniest blood vessels, which are also microscopic. They're called capillaries. So each little alveolus is surrounded by these tiny blood vessels called capillaries. They're only one cell layer in thickness. So you got the alveoli, the air sac, microscopic, one cell layer, and you have the capillaries, what are one cell layer. Now you might say, okay, why did God make them so thin? Well, of course they're microscopic, but they're thin because this is where the gas exchange takes place. So how is that gas exchange going to take place? In other words, what is going to cause the oxygen that is in the atmosphere, which is inside that alveolus, how is it going to get that oxygen to go into a blood vessel? And how is it going to get the carbon dioxide, which is in the little tiny blood vessel, the capillary, how is it going to get it to go into the alveolus so that it can be exhaled? So the gas exchange, think, well, how would that take place? It's got to go through two cell layers. One cell layer of alveolus and one cell layer of a capillary. And the result, or the answer, and I hope you got it right, is moving from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Diffusion. So that's what's causing the carbon dioxide to go into the sac, the microscopic air sac, and what's causing the oxygen to go into the blood. And that's the gas exchange. And it takes place by the process of diffusion. Now breathing, as we've mentioned, is inhaling and exhaling the air. That's the process of breathing. Now one thing that we haven't talked about when we talked about breathing is the muscle that is used to breathe, because there is no muscle in lung tissue. The main muscle for breathing is your diaphragm, which is a huge muscle. It actually divides the top cavity, which is called your thoracic cavity, from the lower one, which is your abdomen. So below the lungs is a large muscle called a diaphragm, and it is by the diaphragm contracting and relaxing which is causing the air to move in and out of your lungs. And the way that works is along with some secondary muscles. and that's the muscles called the intercostals. Remember where they are? They're in between the ribs. So they're moving the rib cage during this breathing. But the main muscle is the diaphragm. And the way that it works is by changing air pressure. When that diaphragm contracts, see if I got a picture here. When it contracts, normally it's way up and high, almost like a bowl upside down. When it contracts, it's flattening, it's getting flatter. So that then is going to cause less pressure in your lungs and more pressure outside. And that's going to cause like a vacuum in your lungs, which is going to cause the air to go in. And then when your diaphragm relaxes and it pops back up into its shape, that again is going to cause air pressure to be greater in your lungs than in the atmosphere, and that's going to what's going to get the breath to come out. So let's go over that again. The movement of your diaphragm causes changes in the air pressure inside your chest. Air rushes into and out of the lungs to equalize the air pressure inside and outside of the body. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, moves down, lowers the pressure, air pressure, and it enlarges the space around the lungs, causing you to be able to then breathe in. During exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes and pops back up into shape, reducing the space, increasing the air pressure, which allows you to exhale. And here's a diagram showing you how the shape of the diaphragm is changing in breathing in and breathing out.
The pressure in the lungs is varied by changes in the volume of the chest cavity. When relaxed, your diaphragm lies in a dome shape under your lungs. When you inhale, the muscles between your ribs contract and your rib cage rises. Your diaphragm contracts, becomes flattened, and moves lower in the chest cavity. As a result, the space in the chest cavity is larger and a slight vacuum forms. Air now rushes into your lungs because the air outside your body is under more pressure than the air inside your lungs. When you exhale, the muscles over the ribs relax and your diaphragm relaxes and returns to its resting dome-shaped position. The relaxation of these muscles decreases the volume of the chest cavity, putting pressure on the air and forcing most of it out of the alveoli.